changes in the landscape due to new regulation. Under NAFTA, an American company is suing the government of Canada for $250 million because Quebec banned fracking. Well, let's all ban fracking. We need that ability, you know, and we need to talk. Last November, 151 House Democrats, including our own Peter DeFazio and Kurt Schrader, sent a letter to Obama opposing fast-tracking of this treaty. We don't want to and we shouldn't cede Congress's power over trade policy. So-called free trade is not always the best policy. When we were colonies, we benefited from that relationship with Britain. And when we were a young nation, we benefited from protecting our industries as they developed. We had the highest wages in the world and the fastest growth rates for most of our history. We benefited from strategic trade policies and fair trade policies, and that's what we should have now. We need to facilitate the employment of all Americans who want to work. We need to facilitate living wages and shared prosperity, facilitate a shift to renewable energy and fighting climate change, facilitate regulation of health scourges like tobacco, and facilitate a much less unequal distribution of income, wealth, health, and educational opportunities, and take and keep control of our regional and national economies and lives. Thank you.
Is this forum against fast?
It says here to thank Mary, but I think the applause was better than my thank you. Joining us from Lewis and Clark College is a professor of economics, Martin Hart Landsberg, to discuss the impact of trade agreements on our jobs and our environment. Martin.
Thank you. So now I have two hard acts to follow. Globalization is a process that's shaped by power, and current globalization dynamics reflect corporate interests. Sadly, these dynamics have produced a globalization process that is harmful to almost all workers. U.S. companies have globalized their production for obvious reasons. They get to lower labor costs, lower environmental costs, and enable themselves to increase their profits. Since they no longer need to invest here in the United States, because the production takes place outside, they haven't used any of the added profits they've made to invest here or to hire workers here. Rather, what have they done with their profits? They've boosted dividends, and they're busily buying back their own stock. The reason the stock market has gone up is because about 70% of the purchases are companies buying back their own stock. Because what that does is rewards management and rewards the owners. And so globalization has been a process of generating profits to enrich people at the top. Sadly, the consequences for workers are very different. The lack of investment means what? Slow growth, the lack of jobs, the intense competition that pits workers against each other for jobs means what? That our work processes become more precarious. Wages get bidded down. And in a sense, we become the big losers. Now, you can really understand the power dynamics of globalization by looking at these trade agreements. And the first two speakers have already given you a good sense of that, but I want to go a little bit over some of the same ground, but deeper as well. One of the reasons that these agreements are called trade agreements, whether it's North American Free Trade Agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement, is because the government thinks that we believe there's something such as free trade, and that free trade is good for everyone. So they mask these agreements as free trade agreements because they think they'll win our support. The problem is that these agreements are about everything, I would say but trade. No, trade's a little part of it, but mostly about other things. They normally have some 20 chapters. The U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement that was signed a couple of years ago had 24 chapters. And these chapters have very little to do with trade as we commonly think about it. We don't know precisely what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And while we're here talking about it, I should mention that the government's already involved in another one called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with Europe. It's not just one agreement, it's a continual drumbeat of agreements. And while we don't know exactly what's in these two, because they're negotiated secretly, has been said, there have been leaks. But because these are just more of the same, we know exactly what's in the playbook of the US Trade Representative. We can tell what's in these agreements. We shouldn't be shocked when we hear things. These agreements have a history, from NAFTA to US Korea to all sorts of agreements, and we know pretty much what's going to be in it. But the leaks, at least, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership have already told us that there's an investment chapter. And as Ed Hill was saying, very accurately, what that chapter includes. It's presented to us as a chapter to protect foreign companies, foreign investors, broadly defined, not just companies, but foreign investors, from nationalization or expropriation. But of course it does a lot of things. One is, it says that governments cannot put performance requirements on foreign companies. You can't tell a foreign company to transfer technology. You can't tell it to hire local labor or buy local inputs. You can't tell it that it has to export or shouldn't import. You can't do that. Another thing that the investment chapter does is it grants foreign corporations protection from direct, and here's the kicker, indirect expropriation or nationalization. So what is an indirect nationalization or expropriation? It can be any action taken by a government, and here I'm going to quote, that interferes with an investor's distinct, reasonable investment-backed expectations. Any action that interferes with an investor's distinct, reasonable investment-backed expectations. That's defined as an indirect expropriation. Relevant considerations of whether such an indirect expropriation takes place includes, and I'm quoting, whether the government action imposes a special sacrifice on a particular investor or investment that exceeds what the investor or investment should be expected to endure for the public interest. Okay? Again, it's in this agreement, it was in the Korea agreement, we have a similar type of thing in NAFTA. It gets a little bit bigger each time. This isn't new. Moreover, as also said, this chapter establishes a special court where any corporation or investor that thinks it's not going to make the profits it thought it was going to make can sue any level of government in a secret tribunal that's staffed by lawyers. And in fact, 15 lawyers have participated in 65% of all of the suits. These people make about $1 million, each one of them, per suit. And they are, because they make money, whether they represent corporations, represent governments, or sit on that three-person tribunal that decides the case, they make money. So these people, when one day they represent a company, the next day they're sitting in judgment, the next day they're encouraging a company to sue a government. And the number of suits has been growing astronomically. In fact, there are now investment companies who will go to companies and say, we'll pay 40% of the cost to get 60% of whatever you make. Just recently, Occidental Oil Company sued Ecuador and won $2.4 billion. Why? Because Occidental had got mining rights to explore for oil in Ecuador, and in the contract it said you can't sell your rights at Occidental to another country's company without our approval. Well, Occidental went and sold some of its rights to an Indian company, and so Ecuador, as the contract said, canceled the contract. Occidental sued under these kinds of investment agreements. And the three-person panel said, yeah, you're right, Occidental did violate the contract, but you know, we thought Ecuador really was awful, kind of strict on Occidental, taking away its total contracts. That's just more than should be, so we fined for Occidental, excuse me, $2.4 billion. Anything goes in these tribunals. And as mentioned, we already have cases where Philip Morris is suing Uruguay for $2 billion because Uruguay wants cigarettes to be sold in plain wrappers with healthcare warnings, violation of intellectual property rights. We have a Swedish power company suing Germany because Germany is decommissioning nuclear power plants. As already mentioned, Lone Star, an oil and gas company, is suing Canada because province of Quebec has decided to ban fracking, so it's withdrawing, canceling some licenses, licensing for drilling. We already mentioned a suit in Egypt for government raising the minimum wage. Anything can happen in these tribunals, and they supersede national law, they supersede US law. There's another chapter, intellectual property rights. It seeks to extend the length of patents enjoyed by drug makers, and it does this in several ways. One is it protects evergreening. So if a company has a patent, and the patent's going to expire, and they discover a new use for the same drug, or they change one of the inert properties, then they get another 20-year extension. The intellectual property rights chapter also is making it easier to patent things. In fact, an earlier leak showed that the chapter was actually going to allow the patenting of surgical procedures. Anything can be patented, making money. There's nothing free trade about this. Right? The last example I'm going to give you, and I don't know if this is in the TPP, but it's been in other agreements, and we can only expect that these are part of it, is the government procurement agreement. And what that says is that any level of government, whatever it is, if it wants to purchase goods and services, it can't use any non-economic criteria. And by that they mean they have to go with the lowest cost. Governments would be forbidden from looking at the labor practices of a company, the environmental practices of a company, taking into account whether local labor will be used or not. The cheapest, that's it. 24 chapters in the Korean Free Trade Agreement. We have no idea how many here. Each one of these chapters is very simply about promoting corporate power, reducing the power of the public to regulate economic activity for the public interest. Okay, what about trade? As I mentioned, we hear, if you've ever had an econ class in college or high school, you learn about something called the theory of comparative advantage, Ricardo's theory, which purports to show how free trade benefits people from all the countries involved. Ricardo's theory was a very simple theory. He said, if you assume a world with full employment and that trade and the currencies will move to balance trade and there's no capital mobility, then if you don't allow, if you make sure there's no tariffs and government can't do anything, under those conditions, all the nations involved in trade will benefit. But if you violate any of those assumptions, if you don't have full employment, if currencies don't balance trade, if you have capital mobility, there's no reason to assume that free trade will produce benefits for countries. And that's leaving out the class issue.